So Natasha, we're going to talk about how organisations work, and we're going to have a bit of a conversation about the structure of human services organisations. Where should we start?
Well, I guess probably starting about thinking about if we were to set up an organisation, what are some of the things that we would have to think about? And I guess for me, given that we're talking about human service organisations, so we're talking generally about organisations that are developed to meet a need around health, around education, around welfare, around something that's going to support people, I guess, that you would think that to set up an organisation in that field, there would need to be a reason for that to be set up. So someone would have identified that there's a gap in a service, or that there's a need that's not being met. And I guess, you know, how I would see that happening is that people would come together, that would have a common purpose, a common goal, and talk about the need to develop a support service or a service that could address that. And from there, I guess you would look at how the organisation might present themselves in terms of what's going to be important to the organisation, the way they're perceived in the public and by their clients. And so thinking about things like values, thinking about mission statements, which we don't always hear about these days, but you know, certainly most organisations will still have a value statement or a mission statement around what their intended purpose is and what's important to them. And then from there, thinking about, well, how are they going to deliver this service? And how is it going to be a service that's going to require them to employ staff? Generally it is. And then how are they going to employ their staff? What sort of staff are they looking for? Which will be determined, I think, if we go back a step, by how much funding they're able to get.
Absolutely.
So thinking about where do we find funding to actually support the organisation to fill this gap in service that we've seen. So I think there's a few things that come into play, and so once people understand their funding base and they've seen the need, and I think that, you know, you were talking earlier, Lynne, about a situation where there was a gap that was noticed by some people in the field.
Yeah, I was thinking about two things as you were speaking. It's really helpful to think about understanding organisations from the beginning up, I think, isn't it? But that in my experience, oftentimes organisations have been around for hundreds of years. So I'll come to that second. But more recently, I think I've seen the development of a brand new organisation where the Department of Human Services said, you know what, we're looking around and we can't see that high-risk young people are adequately having their needs responded to, that they seem to be falling through lots of gaps, that the education service isn't able to hold them when they're really at extreme risk, or to meet their needs, that the adolescent mental health service is not responding in a way that's meeting their needs, and that the Department Child Protection Service isn't responding in a way either. And a really critical report entitled When Care Is Not Enough found that with the highest risk young people in the state, that these young people were falling between the gaps of those three key services, and recommended that a specific service was established to really cross all of those areas, in particular mental health and child protection.
So a good example of a gap being identified, and then going from there to think about how can this organisation be developed.
And that was the squillion-dollar question, and some funds were identified. So as a result of the funding line being identified, there was then a tender in this then still relatively new world of tendering out. A tender specification was developed that said, we want to find an organisation or a consortium of organisations that will be prepared to provide this service that we want to buy for these children. And the Take Two organisation, as it's known, was the successful bidder, and that's a brand new type of organisation. We're going to hear quite a bit of detail about later in the series. So I won't say much about it now, but to say only that it wasn't one agency, it was actually a group that came together and said, we can respond to that need, and they were successful.
And that kind of brings up another point too, in terms of thinking about how organisations are developed. Once you've got that process happening, how do you then go about delivering the service? So what sort of service is going to meet the needs of the client group in the best way? Is it a service where clients come in? And that means, therefore, that you do need a physical structure that has interview rooms, that has offices in it, or is it going to be better for people to go out to see the clients in the community? And that, again, means a different sort of a physical structure for the organisation. And perhaps location becomes part of the conversation as well. Is it an organisation that is only based in a metropolitan area? Or is it an organisation that's actually based out in rural areas as well? And Take Two is another good example.
Of a statewide service.
Exactly, that actually has multiple sites but has one head kind of office in Melbourne as well. So it's kind of, you get to build a bit of a picture about how an organisation actually starts to develop over time. And of course, you know, we need staff when we develop an organisation as well. And so there's some big decisions to be made there about what sort of staff do we employ?
What qualifications, what level of experience,
Exactly.
How do we construct the job roles that the staff go into? And I think position descriptions are really interesting, aren't they? Because they can specify to a greater or lesser extent what are we asking staff to do, but that they also talk about key capabilities.
Yes.
So what does the person look like in terms of what they're able to do? What are their competencies or their capabilities? And I think that looking at position descriptions can give us an awful lot of information about what that job role is and what it might not be inside an organisation.
And as a person applying for jobs too, you get a sense about it, well, can I actually deliver on these capabilities? Is this the sort of role that I want to be in as well? Because it works both ways, from the organisation saying, here are the people that we want, but also from a prospective employee thinking about, well, can I work for this organisation? And quite often people applying for jobs will go back to some of those things we talked about earlier around what's the mission statement of the organisation, what are the value statements, what's the history, if there is one, to make some of those decisions as well.
I might pick up on history a bit, Natasha, because I think that, again, that lovely description that helped me to think about just now, an organisation beginning from the ground up, and what would you think about? In a sense, that's a fairly, for me, luxurious way to go, because oftentimes we have organisations employing social workers that have a huge amount of history, for better or for worse, and it can be not so much thinking about from the ground up what is the service that we want to deliver and how is that best responded to. It can be, what have we been doing in the past, and is that still addressing the need, or do we need to make change? And I know that we're going to talk about change again quite a bit later in this series, but that change can be an incredibly painful and difficult process, and that large bureaucracies are often undergoing change. What I wanted to mention was perhaps an organisation that I work for as quite a new social worker, very, very long time ago, Ballarat Children's Homes, where that was just the case. I came into the social work role where there had previously been a large orphanage housing hundreds of children who, for one reason or another, were not able to live at home. Not all of their parents had died, some had. Others were in the care of the children's homes for a range of reasons. The parents may have been imprisoned or unable to care for them. There was an overrepresentation of Aboriginal children in that orphanage, and at the time that I came to that organisation, it was still called Ballarat Children's Homes, but the orphanage had closed down and the children were located in 10 family group homes, and I guess I'd call them mini institutions because there were family group homes all over Ballarat housing about 6 children in each family, and each home was staffed by a couple who were on duty 24 hours a day with some support. I guess I mention that because just one indicator of the issue of change and whether the service is the service that we need to deliver was a question about the name, Ballarat Children's Homes. And at that time, there was a question about whether we should be calling the organisation something to do with family, Ballarat Children's Homes and Family Services, because they were already offering family support, counselling, financial assistance, and a range of other support and preventative services, yet they were still called Ballarat Children's Homes. And there were huge debates within the organisation, huge debates. And in the end, it almost got stuck because it was legal advice to say you could only leave money in your will if it was to Ballarat Children's Homes.
Oh, okay.
And in the end, the name was changed at that time to Ballarat Children's Homes and Family Services, and that was able to accommodate
because it had that
legal issue.
The front of the name as well. It's an interesting point about, I guess, choosing a name for an organisation or choosing a name for a service, and how people in the community actually relate to that name.
Yes.
And I guess, you know, there are times even as a worker in the field where I might have been looking for a particular service for a referral for a client, but I wasn't actually clear by the name immediately about what they offered.
So important, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I guess if the name is going to be different to what the organisation offers, there needs to be another way to be able to, you know, communicate and convey that to the community as well. I'm not sure what that other way could be, but the name does make a little bit of a difference in terms of how the organisation is able to present themselves. And I wonder if it has an impact on their ability to tender too in some ways. Like if they're, you know, if they're tendering for a service that doesn't immediately fit with their name, you know, I wonder how people making decisions about tender think about that in terms of, well, does this organisation really work with older people if they're called, you know, generally something that might be a family service or, you know. So all important things to think about when we set up our organisation.
There is so much to think about. I guess what also comes to mind in relation to name is part of the overall branding, is the common parlance. And Berry Street, for example, Berry Street, Victoria, I think still have something like "We never give up," and then they'll have another line about Berry Street believe that all children should have a good childhood. So I think that tells us quite a bit about what their mission is and what their values are.
Their values statement very clearly. One in Bendigo is St Luke's have respect, hope and fairness as part of their, I guess, motto, they would call it. And so that's actually on their webpage. That's actually on a lot of the literature that they have as well. And again, immediately you're getting a sense of things that are important to this organisation.
And I guess I really want our students to be looking for and thinking about and going beyond the name, but also really starting to understand the history and what that might mean. What is the service? How are decisions made about the reason for the organisation as they start to think about their visit, their key task?
Absolutely. And I think the history is really important. And I know we'll touch on this more when we talk about some of the forces and tensions, but some of the agencies that we've even mentioned today started off as church-based and church-based funded organisations and have shifted into being government funded in part as well. So I think that history has an impact on how they've actually been shaped over time. So for students when they're visiting agencies to get a sense of how did the organisation start, what was the reason behind it, and how has that changed over time, and have things like the value statements and the mission statements changed over time as well, and what might have been driving that. I think that's all really interesting for people to kind of think about as well. So when we think we've got our organisation organised and we're perhaps wanting to have a look at it, another way that we can think about it is in terms of the 4 R's, Lynne, that we've talked about. The 4 R's makes it easy for me to remember what they are, but thinking about what roles are in the organisation, what are the relationships within the organisations, things around decision making and some of that team leader sort of responsibility, record keeping, how are records kept, and rules. What are the rules that that organisation actually has to think about in terms of how they deliver their work? That you know the staff also need to think about as well.
What are they, and how prescriptive are they?
Exactly, and how can an organisation, or how as a worker, if you've got say legislation, which I won't talk about too much now, but how as a worker do you know how to interpret that legislation in the context of the work that you're doing? Do we want to spend a little bit of time talking about the 4 R's?
Let's do that.
Okay, and we touched on the one around roles a little bit before when we talked about
position descriptions.
And as you said, that's the way that you know you can actually get a sense of what are people required to do in this organisation. What I often have a little bit of a laugh about when you look at position descriptions is that there's usually this overarching little, role description that'll say something like, and whatever the team leader asks you to do.
Other duties as required. Other duties as required is absolutely standard line in the bureaucracy that I come from.
Exactly.
Yes.
So they do tell you a lot, but there's a lot that they don't actually tell you about in terms of the roles. And my own experience of going into new roles has been, okay, this is what I've been asked to do. But then pretty quickly getting a sense of this is how it's done. Yes. So this might be what I've been asked to do, but in this particular organisation, this is how it's done. So there's a particular culture in the organisation that influences that, or there's a particular team leader that influences the way that things are done as well. So position descriptions do tell us a lot, but there's a lot
they only tell us so much, don't they?
Exactly. And again, when the students are actually interviewing the social workers in their organisations, if they can get a position description to start off with and then actually put the story of what the social worker does as well together with the position description, I think that they'll see there are some differences around that.
Absolutely. And it's a wonderful template, I think, because typically social workers won't be on a day-to-day basis in organisations reflecting on or analysing their own organisations. They'll be too busy doing the work.
That's right.
And so it can be really helpful for our students to be saying, gee, in looking at this is a template, we're wondering what might be an accurate reflection and in what ways the job in fact might be different.
And jobs change a little bit over time too, don't they? But organisations don't always update their position descriptions until they need to recruit again, and then they'll go, actually this position description we had 3 years ago, we're actually asking something different from these staff now, and so we need to be thinking about what other capabilities are we looking for, or what other roles might they be required to do. So they do change over time as well.
So record keeping, shall we go to the second of the R's, or was that the third of the R's? I'm not sure.
I don't think there's an order. I think that's okay. But the record keeping is an interesting one. I might tell a little bit of the story if that's okay around that. When I was an undergraduate student, as part of my degree, which was in the late 1980s, to kind of put it in some sort of context, we actually undertook a small research project in our final year, and myself and another student interviewed a 21-year-old, she might have been, young woman who had been in foster care for all of her life, and she had decided to request her file under freedom of information, which was a relatively new thing around that time. You didn't really hear about a lot of people taking up that option to request the file under freedom of information. So she requested the file, and the research project had two kind of components to it. The first was to talk with her about her experience of receiving and reading through that file, and then the other part of the project was to actually have a look at the changes in case note practices over time, because we had from the 1970s through until the late 1980s in terms of records around that. And I guess as an undergraduate it was a very powerful experience for me, because we sat and spoke with this young woman who was quite emotional. She'd received the files a couple of months earlier, so it wasn't the first time she'd actually spoken about it. But we asked her to talk about her experience of receiving that file and reading through it. And she was actually quite upset about it because of some of the way the notes were kept in that file. So, for example, one of the comments that she remembered quite clearly was that one of the very early workers had commented that the young woman, who would have been very little at the time, was a rather ugly looking child.
Oh my goodness.
So that was something that really stuck with her, but also the comments they made about her mother, who made the decision to actually give up her child for foster care. So the young woman was born with disabilities, and so there were some physical disabilities that were apparent for her that became less apparent as she became older, but as a child were probably looked more exaggerated, and so there was lots of commenting around her physical appearance around that as well. So for her it was quite distressing. For me, looking back through the notes and then looking at how they changed over time, you could clearly see that in the 70s, lots of description. that really had nothing to do with the task at hand for that particular worker at time, moving through more into the late 80s where things were, and they were handwritten notes, which was a whole challenge in itself to be able to read them. Moving through until the late 80s where they were more likely to be typed and much more factual based, much more, you know, this was the purpose of the contact, this is what was discussed, and this was the outcome of it. So for me, it kind of highlighted the importance of not being judgmental and not being really descriptive, because that's not part of the role, and being factual, but also thinking about, if I have to keep records in an organisation, and in human service organisations you do because of legal reasons, but also because you want to be able to you know, track the work that you're doing, being able to explain to clients your plans around that as well. So if I'm keeping them, to be really thinking about, if I was to read this about me, how would I feel about it? If the client was to read this, how would they feel about it? Am I writing it in a way that's factual but not judgmental? And so it became a really important part of my practice after that. And look, I think, you know, when you can, you write records, any sorts of records, in a collaborative way with your client. That's not always possible because of how organisations work. But St Luke's, again, in Bendigo, that is part of their practice. They've built their organisation around being respectful and actually inviting clients to write their own case notes in some occasions, but certainly to have access to a shared copy of that. So I think, you know, to me, that's the most respectful way to be able to do that, so that there's no surprises for clients at any point along the way. But however, the organisations will determine that. They will actually have policies around how you write records, how you keep them, why you keep them, from case note recordings through to minutes of meetings, through to annual reports. There will be, the organisation will lead that. But I think if as social workers we've got some flexibility around that, that we can actually do it in terms of thinking about the most respectful way for the client around that.
That's a fantastic and very powerful example, and I think one of the things that comes up for me in response to that example, Natasha, is such a strong sense of this being a core part of social work, because I have to say that as a former employer of new graduate social workers, very often workers would really resent the amount of time spent undertaking case note recording, and not see that as core part of the work, that it's really only the face-to-face, that's the real work, Lynne, and why do I have to keep all of these records? And I guess I just think about that story and the woman's response and her right to read things that were written in a way that were respectful and factual. I guess I have a similar but different experience in that only recently I've undertaken a bit of work as a private practitioner before coming to the university in undertaking child death inquiries for the Victorian system, where children had died known to child protection, or where there had been allegations that they might have been abused in care. So not to alarm people who are listening and watching this podcast about the content, but to say that what that involved was reading a child's file from the beginning to the end. And so I've read quite a few files in that way. And some of the things that really struck me about recording are that in a busy workplace, and I absolutely acknowledge that caseloads can be higher than practitioners want or need them to be, that caseworkers are not always reading the file that they're writing into. And so material can be absolutely contradictory, it can not know what it doesn't know, and really important life events like a child having been sexually abused, child violence in the family, really important life events may not appear to be known by the writer at that time. So the importance of history.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just thinking, as you're talking about the way we keep case notes and in terms of child protection and a lot of other organisations now, they're going on to computer in terms of that. So I wonder how more challenging that is in terms of like if the file's here in front of you kind of can, you know, flick through it. Do you think there's that creates a bit of difference, or is it easier? I don't...
I find it easier to read. I always found other people's handwriting, because I worked for such a long time. I worked with paper files, and no one could ever read my writing. So from that point of view, but I think there is a vulnerability, and there's a sense of who else is going in a statewide service system where the file can be read rather by anyone in the state. So there can be a tendency for minimalist recording.
I think so. And Centrelink, which is where I worked, is, I would say, would be similar. That you know, the information that was accessible to everyone through that system. We're very cautious about what we wrote. We had another electronic system that only social workers could access. And again through the network though, and we were able to put more detail on that. But it's a different organisation, you know, different kind of, I guess, you know, Centrelink was working across many different client groups, and so not all of the information is relevant for everybody there. But in child protection, the information that's on the screen is relevant to anyone who might get into that file.
It is.
It is. It's interesting for organisations, I think, to be really clear about the purpose of record keeping and what it's about. Is it about accountability? Is it about delivering a good service to clients? Or is it about, you know, having some way of knowing what's going on for clients should a worker move away or be unwell? And I think it's probably all of those reasons. But I think it's really important that organisations understand that, because then they need to think about, well, who does have access to the files and why?
And what's our policy about what we're writing and how we're writing it?
Exactly. So that's two of the R's.
Yes, it is.
That's roles and records. Now, rules. Did you want to mention anything about rules, or do we want to save that for a later date?
I think that I think that it's important to, I'll just touch on rules but not focus on them too much, but it's important to understand both the processes and procedures, what's written about the way we do our business. So it's very important, they are the rules. It's a bit like, for me, what else requires rules? Learning to drive and understanding this huge manual that my daughter, who's recently learned to drive, and understanding this huge body of knowledge. What's optional? What's the good, you know, the good practice versus what's the must do? You know, you don't go through a red light. And that's really important. Versus, you know, what's about safe driving and good practice in driving. Similarly, are there policies or practice guidelines that are mandatory, and are there practice guidelines that are promoting good evidence-based or good practice that are recommended? Really important for practitioners to learn about the difference.
Absolutely.
I think to say the relationship between rules and legislation that you touched on before, that we are going to interview Richard, who's a colleague and a lawyer, and he's going to talk a little bit about that later.
Which is great. And in the organisation, that's the reality for the workers, isn't it? For the social workers and the other workers in the organisation. But how do we actually work within legislation, within the organisation, policies as well? How do we actually do our work with clients around that? So that'll be interesting to have that chat with
see what Richard's got to say.
It'd be great. And then the last of the R's is around the relationships in organisations and how. I guess when I think of relationships, yes, it's about how you get on together and about the culture that's developed, but it's also about having an understanding of who is responsible for what.
Reporting relationships.
Exactly, and the communication and the decision-making relationships
and I think,
as well.
Thank you. I think this goes to roles, but let's keep it under relationships, because that really helps me to know how to read an organisational chart, for example. And org charts are something that I'm really interested in, because they help me to know how flat the structure is versus how hierarchical.
Yeah.
They help me to know the span of control that a particular manager or director might have. For example, are they just managing social work in a particular area? So is the organisation structured in a way that one of the expressions that we use is siloed?
Yes.
And are we just responding to that bit of service users' needs, that is disability, for example, or housing over here, or potential vulnerability, children and families? Or is it a more generic organisational chart where a particular director is spanning a range of services? Oftentimes it will be just within a statutory organisation or within a community services organisation, but not always. There can be more complicated relationships too.
Yeah. I had an interesting experience working in more recent years with an organisation where it was a schools-based program.
Okay.
But we actually worked for, it was Centrecare. So we were employed by Centrecare, but as a team, we spent our time out in the schools. So, and we very rarely ever met as a team.
Okay.
So there might have been a crossover at time at the end of the day when we might come back from the schools, be back in the office by 4, and then we were kind of gone by 5.
Oh, okay.
Many of us were part-time, so the chance for crossover became less.
Yep.
So there was probably once a month where all of us as a team would be together for maybe an hour.
Okay.
So it was a really interesting experience of how do you manage the relationships around the team.
Yes.
How do you manage the decision-making relationships? Because the person who was overseeing the team was always in the office.
Yes.
So we had to go back to that person for decisions.
Sure. Yep.
And how do you actually get a sense of accountability and what's actually happening within that team when we're across 11 schools? So across 11 schools, there are only 5 staff.
Yes.
Across 11 schools, and we weren't in the same school every day. So it's quite a complex arrangement of relationships. Because I think of the people in that team, we worked it really well, but it could have been quite different if people preferred to be more autonomous and didn't then bring the link back to also being part of a team. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make a lot of sense.
Because we had to work autonomously,
yes,
but we also needed to work together as a team, so that we knew that our quality assurance was the same across, that we were doing the same things across the board. And we relied on each other by phone if we had tough cases. So we would ring one of our colleagues if we couldn't get the team leader and actually say, look, I'm not sure where I need to go with this. Have you got some time to talk it through? So a lot of it was done, I wouldn't say virtually, because it's not, we were in other places, but we had to think of different ways to be able to maintain those relationships and think about, as a team then, how did we make decisions about the work that we were doing? So it can be complicated, can't it, too, in terms of, not everyone being in the same place at the same time, not necessarily that siloed aspect that we think about, but just that actually the work is delivered in a different way.
Yes, yes.
Hope that made some
that did make a lot of sense. That made a lot of sense. And I'm thinking that we'll hear again later in this series from Beck, who will talk specifically about her role in child protection and the importance of relationships, partnership and collaboration. So perhaps I won't say anything more about that now. Because really coming toward the end of this particular conversation, will we think about the issue of forces and tensions?
I was just thinking the same thing, because it does talk to that, really, doesn't it, around what some of the forces and tensions are, and I guess what becomes of interest in beginning to understand organisations, and we're just in the early stages of doing that, and we've just started to think about structure and what informs structure and why is that interesting, mission, vision, values, the reason for the organisation, roles, the 4 R's, as you've said, that overlaying all of that are the complications, I guess, and one way of looking at that is looking at some of the forces and tensions that might be at play that takes us out of describing what is, I think, and takes us into beginning to analyse what might be or what we think we're seeing. Happen the same the way that they do, for sure. And I think one of the big things is around the siloing that you've spoken about earlier, and how that's really come about. And I think that we were both working at the time where, particularly in Victoria, the tendering and the competitive tendering arrangements, really became the way that organisations were funded, so that organisations that perhaps might have been assured of their funding and assured that they would continue to do the work that they were doing.
Not any longer.
And they were in fact competing against organisations that they perhaps had worked together with in some ways before for the same bucket of money to be able to do the job. So it set the scene for a very different way, I think, of human service organisations working, because they, in order to keep their own organisation alive, if you like, they needed to be competing against other people that probably had very similar interests and perhaps in the past had been good collaborators around projects, but that people were protective of their own space. And not just about the organisation, but of course about security for their staff as well in terms of the programs. And I think that we, in the past, there's been some talk about how you overcome silos. I think we have seen partnership arrangements that have occurred. The consortium arrangement around Take Two that you were talking about too is perhaps another example of that. But on the whole, my sense is that organisations in some ways still work in terms of doing the work that they do.
That they're funded to do. Inside that contract.
Exactly. And that can sometimes, and you alluded to it before, mean that there's one arm of the organisation doing this, another arm of the organisation doing that, and that there might actually be silos within organisations as well.
Yes, of course.
And not as much. And I don't know that it's intentional, but not as much sharing of resources. And perhaps not always the best experience for the client too. And the fact that a client might now need to go to this organisation to have this need met, to this organisation to have this need met, and then perhaps have a third organisation involved as well, because one organisation only has one part of the funding bucket around that as well. And I think that's a real tension for human service organisations. And I've certainly worked in organisations where funding hasn't been achieved for the next round, and the organisation hasn't been able to absorb staff back into the organisation, into other roles, so it's meant that positions have just finished, and that those programs have just finished within that organisation, and so they're looking for other money, to kind of keep things going.
And people potentially becoming redundant.
Exactly.
And really very stressful times. I guess what you've done is really nicely paint a picture of some of the forces and tensions at the wider sector level across organisations. What comes to mind for me is within organisations some of the forces and tensions that relate to the same kind of issues though, because I think what we're talking about is the move into business-like principles, sometimes known as a concept like of managerialism, referred to as managerialism rather, and it doesn't always work in the best interests of clients. I think that we all have a sense where it can be a clunky way of arranging a service where you apply business-like principles. And on the one hand, my history in Department of Human Services and Child Protection, it can be a way of ensuring efficiency when there has been, for example, in the early 80s, evidence of real corruption and inefficiency. And the early introduction of those kind of principles meant that people who were in large institutions who were falsifying records about the hours that they were working or the shifts that they were working were sacked. And with good reason. But what it can also mean today is that with the real tightening of examination of practice, is that the focus can be on efficiency at the expense of effectiveness. And what do I mean by that? There can be a focus on visiting in a timely way. That means that things are done in a rushed manner or are done before adequate planning and consultations taken place. And we are going to talk about that in a bit more detail later, but just to flag that that's a real tension potentially within organisations.
And I think that as new graduates going into organisations too, that people are walking into practices that have developed out of these tensions. So they might go in with eyes wide open and wanting to do things a little bit differently,
Yes.
but the forces from within the organisation
Really
actually start to shape, how they might practice. So, and I think it is something that social workers and new graduates need to be very mindful of when they go into an organisation, to be that fresh look at how are things done.
Yes.
And the curious questions that new graduates and students on placement can ask that actually help people take that deep breath and take that step back and think about actually what are we doing here?
Yes.
Where is the client in this? And I think that the tensions you're talking about around managerialism, it's often what we do for the client that can be impacted upon, because they, once upon a time, we might have actually looked outside of what our immediate brief was in terms of what could we do in this particular situation. But now, because
being a bit creative.
Exactly. But now, because we're constrained a little bit, it's, oh, look, I would really like to be able to work with you about the relationship difficulties you're having with your child, but my job is actually to talk to you about housing.
Yes.
So I know they kind of relate, but I'm only paid to do this part of it. Not that you use those words with the client.
No.
You might think, well, I can only really do
finding
this.
a way to focus it down.
Exactly. And I'm allocated, or I have to meet a certain number of visits.
Targets.
And targets. And if I spend time doing this, I'm not going to, be able to justify the time. And I think that's a real worry when we're talking about vulnerable people who generally social workers are working with as well.
That's right.
I was just saying, one of the other things I see happening around, again, thinking about organisations and thinking about the staff in organisations is the way that people are employed in organisations now. So once upon a time, I would have been employed because I was a social worker to do a social work role. But now I can be employed in a range of roles. I can be employed as a mental health worker, I can be employed as a housing worker, a drug and alcohol worker. And so my title won't say social work.
In fact, the majority probably don't.
Exactly. And then what that also means is that I'm working alongside people, perhaps in organisations who come from a psychology background, a nursing background, a teaching background, a behavioural science background. And it's not clear what the background from all of the workers might be. So one of the challenges I think that social workers have, and it would be similar for other professions, is to think about what is it about the way I'm doing things that is because I'm a social worker, and how do I maintain my professional identity as a social worker in an organisational structure that actually doesn't identify me as one. And for some people that might not be important, but generally I think in social work it is, because there is something about the way we work that is different to the other professions around us. And I think that can be a challenge for social workers in organisations to think about how do I maintain the connectedness with other social workers, and how do I maintain the sense of what it means to be a social worker in this organisation?
Or develop, as a new graduate, develop and maintain. And oftentimes really needing to anchor yourself in the values and the code of ethics, and looking at some really core theoretical models. I'm thinking about ecological developmental theory, and thinking about how is that influencing what I can do and what I should do, and does my colleague over here, who might have a different professional background or academic background, see the world differently. And it doesn't mean that I'm right and she's wrong, but that really recognising the unique contribution, because I have a social work background, that I bring.
Absolutely, and bringing that out, making sure that comes out, that this is what I'm adding to this conversation that we're having, this is what I'm adding to the way we're working with the clients. Being able to do that. So I think that is a challenge, and hopefully, part of, I think, what we do as in terms of our teaching across the 4 years or the 2 years is about giving people the confidence and the skills to be able to go out there and say, this is what I bring as a social worker around this.
And I guess as we come to a conclusion, one of the things that I'd be hoping our students do, again, when they go out to interview the social worker, is to really unpack, is that job entitled social work? Is their job position social work? And if not, what does that mean for that person? What are some of the forces and tensions at work or at play?
Great.
All right.
Good note to end on.
Yeah, I think so.